All right, ready to dive deep. Today, we're tackling something a bit of a head scratcher. Ellen White's views on cities. It's like one minute she's saying, get out, and the next, it's all about city mission being crucial.
It is a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? But that's what we're here for, right? To sort through it all. And we've got a good chunk of material to work with spanning from 1882 to 1914, over 30 years of her thoughts on this.
Exactly. And to really wrap our heads around it, got to put on those history hats. Imagine London, December 1952.
Oh, the great smog.
Yeah, 5 days of thick, choking smog, so dense you couldn't see your hand in front of you, cars abandoned, football matches canceled, life just stopped, and thousands died from the pollution. Many with, lasting lung problems.
It really does highlight just how dangerous cities could be back then. Not just London, of course. EGW wasn't just being dramatic when she talked about the health risks.
No, she was laying it out there. In 1905, she wrote in Ministry of Healing, "The physical surroundings in the cities are often a peril to health. The constant liability to contact with disease, the prevalence of foul air, impure water, impure food, the crowded, dark, unhealthful dwellings are some of the many evils to be met."
Strong words. And what's interesting is that she wasn't alone in this. Statisticians at the time, like Adna Weber in 1899, were recording the same thing. City folks had way shorter lifespans than those in rural areas.
So it makes sense, her saying to get out of the cities, at least back then, it was about keeping people safe. But here's the thing, if they were so bad, why push for mission work there? Kind of contradictory, isn't it?
It does seem that way, yeah.
Mm.
And I think understanding her view on institutions versus individuals is key here. You see, she was really worried about the impact of cities, especially on, kids and those who were more vulnerable.
So when she said to move schools and sanitariums outside of cities, it was all about creating these safe spaces.
Exactly, like Southern California Sanitarium. In 1902, she was very clear that it needed to be well outside the city limits. She even said that a city is no place for a sanitarium. She wanted those places to be havens, away from the pollution and, well, the moral dangers of city life.
But then, and this is where it gets tricky, she calls for individuals to be right in the thick of it, doing mission work in those same cities.
You've got it. It's like she's saying, protect the vulnerable, get them out, but send in the strong to, work for the city's good.
So not a simple cities are bad message at all.
Not even close. She wasn't afraid to get into the complexity. She was always trying to balance things out, trying to find that middle ground. And in this case, it was about keeping people healthy and spiritually grounded while also taking the gospel to those growing cities.
It really is this back and forth, isn't it?
Yeah.
Protect but reach out. It makes me think of those outpost centers she talked about. What exactly did she have in mind there?
Well, picture it like this. Property strategically placed outside the city, but close enough to launch mission work from. It's a fascinating idea that she starts talking about around 1905.
Okay, now I'm really curious. Did she mean for people to commute every day from these outposts or to actually live in the city? It's not always super clear in the material we have.
You're right, it can be a bit ambiguous. To understand it better, we gotta look at specifics. Take Boston, for instance. In 1905, EGW was adamant that Boston needed to hear the Adventist message. She highlighted the New England Sanitarium in Melrose, which was only about 8 miles north of the city, as a key outpost for this work.
And Melrose had a good train line to Boston back then, right?
Yeah, so a daily commute was totally possible. And on top of that, by 1907, Adventists were running a health food restaurant and store right in downtown Boston, near Boston Common. EGW even talked about the need to reach both the outskirts and the inmost parts of the city. It all suggests a kind of coordinated effort, with people maybe coming in from Melrose to staff those city initiatives.
So like a two-pronged approach. The outpost is a base, a place to recharge, but also supporting a presence right in the middle of the city.
That's a great way to put it. And here's the thing, this model wasn't set in stone. It seems like it was adapted to each city's unique situation.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. What other examples do we have?
Well, let's jump over to Sydney, Australia. In 1903, EGW urged John Burden, who was about to start medical missionary work in Wahroonga, a suburb of Sydney, to focus on both the city and the surrounding suburbs. Now, this was a few years before she consistently used the term outpost center, but...
It sounds like she was already thinking along those lines.
Right, exactly. And just like in Boston, Adventists had a solid presence right in Sydney's city center. They had a health food company, a vegetarian restaurant on a main street, and even the offices of the Australasian Union Conference and the New South Wales Conference were downtown.
Hard to imagine those offices being staffed solely by people commuting in from Warringah every day, even with the train line.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? But we do know that some medical missionaries, like Dr. Daniel Kress and his wife, Dr. Loretta Kress, divided their time between Warunga and Sydney Center. So for them, Warunga definitely acted as that suburban base for reaching into the city.
So it seems like her vision for city mission was flexible, not about a rigid model, but more about adapting to what each location needed.
Absolutely. It shows that she was a practical thinker, focused on finding solutions that worked, not just sticking to strict rules.
This is getting really interesting. Let's hear some more of these city-specific examples.
And welcome back to our deep dive into Ellen G. White's perspective on cities. We've been tracing her thinking on this, and it's clear, her ideas weren't static. She was always adapting, refining based on experience, changing times, and even pushback from folks she was trying to lead.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to see how she dealt with those practical challenges of mission work in a world that was becoming more and more urban. We've been talking about these outpost centers, those rural sanitariums. They seem to be a big part of her strategy. But we also saw cases where Adventist workers were living right in the heart of those cities she considered pretty dangerous.
Yeah, and that raises some interesting questions about the role of those sanitariums that were further out, like St. Helena Sanitarium in Napa Valley. That was a good distance from San Francisco, a city she really wanted to reach.
Right. Doesn't seem like commuting daily from St. Helena to San Francisco would have been doable back then. So what was the connection? How did those more rural sanitariums fit into this whole idea of city mission?
Well, even if workers weren't commuting every day, those rural sanitariums could still be really important in supporting city missions. Remember, EGW was a huge advocate for medical missionary work. She saw it as a way to reach people both physically and spiritually. She thought it was a powerful way to break down walls and open hearts to the gospel.
So those rural sanitariums were like training grounds, getting workers ready with the skills and knowledge to be effective medical missionaries in the city.
Exactly. They were preparing nurses, doctors, and other healthcare workers who could then go into those tough urban environments and offer, well, not just treatment, but health education, compassionate care, all with that spirit of Christian service.
Kind of like building a bridge, right? Using practical help and genuine care to connect with people on a deeper level. But wasn't she also worried about the, moral dangers of city life? Wouldn't sending workers into those environments be risky, exposing them to the very things she warned about?
And that's where the second key role of these rural sanitariums comes in. Think of them as places of rest, renewal, a chance to spiritually recharge for those working in the thick of city mission.
Ah, so it's like a strategic retreat. You go out, do the hard work of urban mission, then you come back to a place of peace and support to regain your strength.
You got it. EGW knew that maintaining spiritual and emotional well-being was crucial for anyone involved in such demanding and often emotionally draining work. She believed those rural sanitariums, with nature, fresh air, and a supportive community, could offer that much-needed break.
It's a fascinating dynamic. Makes me think of that quote from EGW where she says, "Wherever the people of God are placed, in the crowded cities
Yeah.
or among the country byways, there is a home mission field."
Exactly. She recognized that mission wasn't limited to a specific location. It was a way of life, a commitment to service no matter where you were. And these rural sanitariums, these outpost centers, were part of that bigger missional picture.
There were places to train and equip workers, but also to nurture and strengthen them for the challenges ahead. It wasn't one or the other, it was about both. Strategic withdrawal and intentional engagement.
Exactly. And I think EGW herself lived this balance. Remember, she lived at Elmhaven, a peaceful country home near St. Helena Sanitarium. She was very involved in the work of the sanitarium and the Adventist mission, but she also knew how important it was to have a place of peace and retreat. It was about finding that balance between engaging with the world and drawing strength from something deeper.
So going back to San Francisco, where she often praised the work of the mission there, even though it was quite far from St. Helena Sanitarium, how did that work? Where were the workers actually living?
Well, it seems pretty clear that they were living right in the city itself. The yearbook listings for the San Francisco mission workers, the doctors, pastors, literature evangelists, they all give addresses within the city. She even described San Francisco as a busy beehive of Adventist activity.
The beehive, I love that image. Really captures the energy and all the different types of mission work going on there. It wasn't some hands-off, distant approach. It was about being present right there in the community.
Yeah, right. And that brings up another interesting question. If workers were living in the cities, What exactly was the role of those more distant sanitariums, like St. Helena? How did they actually support the work being done on the ground?
So they were more than just places for training and retreat. Did they have a more direct link to the city missions?
That's a question we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Back again for our deep dive into Ellen White's views on cities. It's been quite a journey uncovering her evolving thoughts on this topic.
It has. We've seen how her thinking developed, from those early warnings about the dangers of city life to her emphasis on strategic and compassionate engagement with urban communities.
And remember those outpost centers she envisioned? Those rural sanitariums. They played a big role in supporting that engagement, serving as training grounds, places of rest for weary workers, and even launch pads for reaching into the city. But we left off with a question about the connection between those more distant sanitariums and the city missions themselves, especially when workers were living right there in the city.
Right. If workers weren't commuting from places like St. Helena Sanitarium to San Francisco every day, how were those institutions directly involved in supporting the mission work in the city? Well, one way was through referring patients. EGW often encouraged city folks who needed treatment to go to those rural sanitariums where they could benefit from the fresh air, the peace, and a more holistic approach to healing.
So it was about creating a pathway, guiding people from the city to these rural havens where they could experience not just physical healing, but also spiritual renewal,
Yeah,
kind of extending the mission's reach beyond the city itself.
exactly. And by sending patients to these sanitariums, city missionaries were also creating chances for more long-term engagement. Remember, EGW believed that real conversion often meant changing your lifestyle, and these rural sanitariums provided an environment where people could step away from the pressures and temptations of city life and, focus on developing healthier habits physically and spiritually.
It's like creating a space for a deeper, more transformative experience. Not just treating symptoms, but getting to the root of the issue, which, for EGW, was often tied to unhealthy living and spiritual disharmony.
Precisely. And this approach wasn't just about medical missionary work. EGW also saw these rural sanitariums as places where city dwellers could connect with nature, learn about gardening and sustainable living, and just experience the joy of a simpler, more wholesome way of life. She believed these experiences could really impact people's spiritual outlook, opening their hearts to the gospel message.
It's interesting how these rural sanitariums, first thought of as places of refuge from the city, became these centers of activity, connecting people from all walks of life and acting as catalysts for spiritual growth and change. But I'm also struck by her growing emphasis on living out the message, embodying the gospel in what you do, right there in those busy urban areas.
Absolutely. As we move into the 20th century, we see this theme becoming more and more central in her writing. She wasn't satisfied with just sending workers into cities for a few hours each day. She wanted them to be fully involved in the lives of the people they were trying to reach, to really understand their needs, build relationships, and show the power of the Adventist message through their own changed lives.
Like she's saying, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. And she wasn't just talking about medical missionary work here. She saw a place for all kinds of Adventists in the cities. Teachers, business owners, artists, homemakers, everyone with a heart for God and a desire to serve.
Right. She believed that the Christian life, lived authentically and compassionately, was a powerful witness in itself. And she challenged Adventists to be that presence in the cities, to be beacons of hope and healing in those places that could often feel dark and chaotic.
It's a powerful vision, and just as important today as it was back then, especially when you consider that now, over half the world's population lives in cities. The opportunities for mission in urban areas are huge.
They are. And EGW, even with her concerns about the dangers of city life, saw those opportunities. She urged Adventists to not shy away from the world, but to engage with it, to be salt and light where it's needed most.
And she gave us some great examples of what that engagement could look like. The work of Stephen Haskell and his wife in Hell's Kitchen, that bustling beehive of Adventist activity in San Francisco, all those vegetarian restaurants and treatment rooms that popped up in cities around the world.
These were all real examples of her vision for urban mission, a vision that wasn't about forcing beliefs on people, but about meeting needs, showing compassion, and demonstrating the love of Christ in practical, everyday ways.
It really is inspiring. It makes us ask ourselves, what about us? Are we willing to be God's presence in the cities? Are we willing to step out in faith and make a difference in those places that are often ignored or forgotten?
It's a good question to think about. And as we wrap up our deep dive into Ellen G. White's perspective on cities, I hope you're leaving with a better understanding of her thoughts and also a renewed sense of the possibilities for mission and ministry in the cities we live in.
Absolutely. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring these topics, to dive into her writings yourselves, and to discover just how rich and relevant her message is for us today. Thanks for joining us on this journey.